A 25-acre patch of land near League City, Texas, off of Interstate 45, has become known as the Texas Killing Fields. Since the early 1970s, over 30 murder victims have been discovered in the area, mostly young women. And the majority of those cases remain unsolved. I'm Enrique Couto, host of Weekly Spooky, and tonight we're going to take a look at what's going on in the so-called killing fields of the Lone Star State. Interstate 45 is a major highway in Texas that runs through some of the state's most populous cities, including Dallas, Houston, and Galveston, and ends at the Gulf of Mexico's shores. Most people refer to it as Interstate 45, while others refer to it as the Texas Killing Fields. Approximately 30 women and girls were murdered along the fields in the 1970s. Some murders remain unsolved, and others are still missing to this day. League City, Texas is a city in Galveston County, which is known to many as the home of the Texas Killing Fields. It's a desolate place with only dirt roads, and if someone cried out for help, it's unlikely that anyone would hear them. And if you run, you'd have nowhere to go. In the 1970s, teenage girls went missing at an alarming rate, ushering in a new era of terror for the innocent. On June 17, 1971, Colette Wilson, a 13-year-old girl from Alvin, Texas, waited for her mother after band practice on County Road 99 and Highway 6. Colette was missing when her mother arrived 6 minutes later. Police informed her family that she had most likely run away, so they declined to investigate. Claire, Colette's mother, would later reveal what the police told her. Quote, "They said she was probably taking drugs or something, that she'd run away. We knew Colette. We knew that wasn't true. But they refused to listen to us. Some parents would hire private detectives, and if they didn't have the money to hire a private investigator after receiving no help from the police, they would enlist the help of their friends and neighbors." Colette's body was discovered 5 months later, on November 26, 1971, near the Addicks Reservoir in Houston, Texas. Colette's father, a dentist, had to identify her remains by inspecting her jaw. More girls and women went missing and were found dead over the next few years. Brenda Jones, 14, of Galveston, Texas, was last seen on July 1, 1971, on her way to see her aunt. Her body was discovered the following day, July 2, 1971, in Galveston Bay, near Pelican Island. Rhonda Renee Johnson, 14, was born on December 16, 1956, in Houston, Texas, and Sharon Lynn Shaw, 13, was born on August 11, 1957, in Mobile, Alabama. Both lived in Webster, Texas, and on August 4, 1972, the two had spent the day at the beach in Galveston a week before Sharon's 14th birthday. They were last seen leaving the beach, but they never returned home. The girls were last seen walking on Galveston's Seaward Boulevard, according to eyewitnesses. 5 months later, on January 3, 1972, two boys fishing in Clear Lake discovered a human skull floating in the water, which they had initially mistook for a ball. 6 weeks later, the rest of the body, along with another body, was discovered in a marsh. On February 17, 1972, the coroner determined that the skull belonged to Sharon Shaw, who was identified through dental records. Sharon's mother identified a crucifix found wrapped around the jawbone of the skull as belonging to her daughter. The body was later identified as Rhonda Johnson. Gloria Gonzalez, 19 of Houston, Texas, was last seen on October 28, 1971, near her apartment on Jacqueline Street. Her remains were discovered near Addicks Reservoir on November 23, 1971, in the same area where 13-year-old Colette Wilson was also discovered. Allison Craven, 12 years old, of Houston, was reported missing by her mother on November 9, 1971. Allison's body was discovered in a pearland field 10 miles from her home on February 25, 1972. Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, both 15 years old, from Galveston, were last seen taking a ride near an island ice cream shop on November 15, 1971. Their bodies were discovered 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, in Turner's Bayou, both bound and partially naked. Kimberly Pitchford, 16 years old, of Houston, was last seen on January 3, 1972, at Dobie High School, where she was waiting to take her driving test. Her body was discovered in a ditch 2 days later, on January 5, 1972. Suzanne Bowers, 12 years old, of Galveston, was last seen walking between the 4,000 block of Avenue S and the 31,000 block of Avenue P at 10:45 a.m. on May 21, 1977. Her skeletal remains were discovered 2 years later, on March 25, 1979, in Alta Loma, Texas. Brooks Bracewell, 12 years old, and her friend Georgia Geer, 14, were last seen on September 6, 1974, at the U-Totem convenience store off of FM 517 and I-45 in Dickinson, Texas. Brooks's remains were discovered in a ditch 7 years later, on April 3, 1981, in Alvin, Texas. Police discovered some of Georgia Geer's remains in 1976, but due to neglect, they were not able to identify her until a new detective took over in 1981 and re-examined the ditch where they were originally found, and her remains were identified as Georgia Geer. Dean Klaus, 20, of New Smyrna Beach, Florida, vanished with his wife and daughter in October of 1980. Dean Klaus and his 17-year-old wife, Tina Klaus, were discovered in a wooded area of Houston on January 12, 1981. In 2022, their identities were announced, and their daughter was discovered alive in Oklahoma. Michelle Garvey was born on June 3, 1967, in Jersey City, New Jersey. When she went missing on June 1, 1982, she was living in New London, Connecticut. Police assumed she was a runaway and that she returned to New Jersey or North Carolina. Michelle had a history of running away, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A month after she went missing, her body was discovered in July 1, 1982, in Baytown, Texas. Authorities were unable to identify the victim at the time, but determined that she was a white female between the ages of 15 and 20, with blue eyes and red curly hair. Strangulation was the cause of death. The victim had an inverted left nipple, was O-positive blood type, and had a scar on one foot, as well as having one of her ears pierced. She was dressed in brown clothing, a long-sleeved brown button-down shirt with horse embroidery on the breast pocket. Her pants were made of corduroy material. She was buried near two other unidentified murder victims, Dean and Tina Klaus, who were identified in 2022. The victim had been sexually assaulted, according to the evidence. In May of 2011, the body was exhumed to obtain a DNA profile to compare matches, including Michelle's brother. Polly Penwell, who used the website Web Sleuths, a true crime community focusing on missing persons, discovered the case and suggested to the NCMEC and the Harris County Medical Examiner that they were the same person. Michelle Garvey was identified in January 2014 after 32 years of being unidentified as a result of her family providing DNA testing samples in August of 2013. After her body was discovered, she was reburied on March 1st, 2014, in Montville, Connecticut. Sandra Ramber, 14, of Santa Fe, Texas, was last seen on October 26, 1983, at her home. She was declared missing because her front door was left open. Food was still in the oven, and her purse and coat were still in the house. Her body was never found. Heidi Villarreal Fay, 23 years old, of League City, Texas, was last seen on October 10, 1983, at a convenience store near West Main Street in Hobbs. Her remains were discovered on the road on April 4, 1984, after a dog brought her skull to a nearby house. Laura Miller, 16, of League City, was last seen on September 10, 1984, at the same convenience store where Heidi Villarreal Fay was seen a year earlier. Laura was calling her boyfriend from a payphone. Her remains were discovered 2 years later, on February 3, 1986, 60 feet away from where police had discovered Heidi Villarreal Fay 2 years before. Audrey Cook, 30, of Galveston, was last seen in December of 1985. She was discovered on the 3000 block of Calder Road on February 2nd, 1986, the same area where Laura Miller and Heidi Villarreal Fay were discovered. She had a small gunshot wound to the back and was identified in April of 2019 using genetic genealogy through family tree DNA. Shelley Sykes, 19, of Texas City, was last seen leaving her job as a waitress at Guido's Beach Restaurant in Galveston on May 24, 1986. Her car was discovered the next day, stuck in the mud, with bloodstains on the side of I-45. Her body was never found. Suzanne Renee Richardson, 22, of Galveston, was last seen working the night shift as a clerk at the Casa del Mar condominiums on October 7, 1988. Witnesses claim to have heard a woman scream, and a single shoe was discovered in the parking lot. Suzanne has never been found or heard from again. Donna Prudhomme, 34, of Nassau Bay, Texas, was last seen in 1991 and was discovered in a field on the 3000 block of Calder Road on September 8, 1991. Lynette Bibbs, 14, and Tamara Fisher, 15, both from Houston, were last seen on February 1, 1996, at a teen club with a 22-year-old male friend. The friend claimed to have dropped them off at a hotel in Houston's Old Spanish Trail. Lynette's body was discovered alongside Tamara's off a dirt road near Cleveland, Texas. They were both shot to death, but police suspected they were shot by different people. Crystal Baker, 13, from Texas City, was last seen on March 5, 1996, after leaving her grandmother's house during a fight. Crystal was seen using the phone at a convenience store, asking a friend if she could stay with her. Her body was discovered 2 hours later. She'd been raped, strangled, and dumped over the Trinity River Bridge on I-10. Crystal's case was solved in 2012 when 45-year-old Kevin Edison Smith was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Governor Greg Abbott signed the Crystal Jean Baker Act in 2019, which allows for the collection of DNA from people arrested for certain felonies before they are convicted. Laura Smither, 12, of Friendswood, Texas, was last seen on April 3, 1997, when she told her mother she was going for a 20-minute jog down the street. Her body was discovered in a retention pond in Pasadena, Texas, 17 days later, on April 20, 1997. Her parents founded the Laura Recovery Center, a nonprofit organization that assists in the search and recovery of kidnapping victims, in 1998. Jessica Kane, 17, of Lamarque, Texas, was last seen eating with her friends on August 17, 1997, at the Bennigan's restaurant near Baybrook Mall in Clear Lake. Her father discovered the truck abandoned along I-45 South around 1:30 a.m. and reported her missing. Jessica's remains were discovered in a field off East Orem Road, next to Hobby Airport, 19 years later, on March 18, 2016. Tot Harriman, the oldest victim, 57, was last seen in League City on July 12, 2001. She was last seen driving her 1995 Lincoln Continental along Highway 35 between League City and Corpus Christi, looking for a new home. She and her car have never been found. Sarah Trusty, 23, of Algoa, Texas, was last seen riding her bike near the Algoa Baptist Church after leaving her home in the evening. A fisherman discovered her body 14 days later, on July 27, 2002, in the Texas City Dike. Teresa Venegas, 16, from Dickinson, Texas, was last seen on Halloween night, 2006, walking near the Green Cay subdivision. Her body was discovered 3 days later, on November 3rd. She had been raped and strangled, and her hair had been cut off in a field across from Dickinson High School. With such an incredible list of victims, you would hope there would be a similar list of suspects. Some of the cases have indeed been solved. Many have not. Some bodies have been discovered, and some have never been found. Michael Lloyd Scott, who owned a gas station and was a convicted sex offender from Galveston, is the first suspect in the murders of Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw. In 1972, he was charged with both murders. After hours of interrogation, he confessed to the crimes. He would assist the officers in finding the bodies. He later recanted his confession, claiming that he was being tortured into confessing by being suffocated with a plastic bag, burned with cigarettes and a radiator, and assaulted by Police Chief Don Morris. Michael Self was convicted of the first-degree murder of Sharon Shaw and was sentenced to life in prison on September 18, 1974. He was not convicted for Rhonda Johnson's murder. 3 years later, in 1976, Police Chief Don Morris and Deputy Tommy Deal were charged and arrested in connection with multiple bank robberies dating back to 1972. Don Morris was sentenced to 55 years in prison, while Tommy Deal received 30 years. Michael Self was denied parole several times and filed numerous appeals before the United States Supreme Court refused a new trial in 1993. Michael Self died of cancer in prison. 2 investigators, a Galveston police officer and a former Harris County prosecutor, thought Michael Self had been wrongfully convicted. Then, someone else confessed to the murders. On April 2, 1980, a man walked into the local police station and claimed responsibility for the killings. He admitted to allegedly tying the girls down with an electrical cord, which was not known to the public and was never mentioned by Michael Self. However, the man was suffering from psychosis, and police dismissed his claim, even though the police were certain they were murdered with an electrical cord, and he lived close to one of the victims. Edward Harold Bell confessed to the murders of several young women in letters sent to the Galveston and Harris Counties prosecutors in 1998. Bell was already serving a 70-year sentence for the 1978 murder of a Pasadena resident 26-year-old former Marine Larry Dickens, who tried to stop him from masturbating in front of a group of teenage girls. Bell admitted to killing 11 girls in total, referring to them as the 11 that went to heaven, and that he was brainwashed into doing so. He named Sharon and Rhonda as two of the girls he murdered, but he was never charged. Edward Harold Bell was named as a suspect in yet another murder. He was arrested and charged with exposing himself 12 times, but never went to prison. Bell lived near the beach in Galveston and worked as a silent partner in a surf shop, which meant he received profits but was not involved in the management. Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, two of the victims, were customers at the store. He then relocated, living near two more victims, Brooks Bracewell and Georgia Jeer. When he murdered the former Marine, he fled to Panama, where he was apprehended and extradited to the United States, and then sentenced to 70 years in prison. He claimed in his letter to police that he couldn't remember the names of all of his victims, but he murdered Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, Colette Wilson, and Kimberly Pitchford, as well as two more girls he kidnapped from Webster in August of 1971, and later identified as Rhonda James and Sharon Shaw. Because there was no evidence, Harold Bell was never charged with any of these murders, and he remained a prime suspect until his death in April of 2019 at the age of 82. Another suspect was Mark Stallings. He was a convicted kidnapper serving a life sentence. He confessed to killing a girl and dumping her body in a field in 1991, and the body was later identified as Donna Prudhomme. Mark was living in League City at the time of the murder, close to the homes of some of the girls who went missing and were later found dead. Mark Stallings was never charged with the murders, but he is still a suspect in the killings of Donna Prudhomme and Audrey Cook, as well as two other Fort Bend County murders. There have been numerous suspects, many of whom have never been convicted of the crimes due to lack of evidence, but there have been some convictions to provide the victims with the justice they deserve. In April of 2012, 16-year-old Crystal Baker's body was found. Kevin Edison Smith was arrested and charged with her murder. Smith was arrested in Louisiana in 2009 on a drug charge. Crystal's dress was tested for DNA, but when she was discovered, the technology was not as advanced as it is now, and his DNA matched on the dress. After 30 minutes of deliberations, the jury found Kevin Edison Smith guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. In 1987, 30-year-old John King called the El Paso police and claimed that on May 24, 1986, he and 33-year-old Gerald Zwarst attacked Shelley Sykes in her car, raping and strangling her. Gerald Zwarst told police that he had hidden the body in one of the fields where other bodies had been discovered. Both men were unable to identify the location of Shelley's body. They were both convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison in 1998. John King died in prison from natural causes in October of 2015. Gerald Zwarst died in prison in November of 2020. William Lewis Reese was arrested in May 1997 for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Sandra Sipo, a 19-year-old Webster woman. The following year, he was found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison. In 2015, his DNA was linked to the murder of Tiffany Johnston, a 19-year-old girl found murdered in Oklahoma in 1997. Following this revelation, Reese confessed to the murders of Jessica Kane and Kelly Cox, leading the investigators to the bodies' burial locations. He was suspected of kidnapping and killing Laura Smither and admitted to Friendswood Police in 2016 that he did indeed end her life. Reese was convicted of Johnston's murder and sentenced to death in 2021. He was extradited to Texas the following year and convicted of the murders of Smither, Kane, and Cox, receiving a life sentence after pleading guilty to each of the 3 murders. And that is the shockingly expansive case of the Texas killing fields, the 25-acre land where 30 female victims were found. Many people believe it was the work of a serial killer, and many think it was just a dumping ground. Very few murders have been solved, and still today some victims have never been found and never gotten the justice they deserve.